The heavy sound of the deadbolt clicking into place against the Maine blizzard felt more like a final judgment than a simple lock, sealing me out in the sub-zero darkness, while my own family toasted to my sister's new studio inside our warm home. I am Janelle, and at 15 years old, I stood shivering on the frozen porch because my parents decided that my existence was an inconvenience compared to Lily's sudden desire for more creative space. Standing there with nothing but a thin jacket and the bitter realization that I was being discarded, I watched the golden light from the living room window where they sat together, acting as if I had never even existed. They told me I was nothing, while Lily smirked from my former bedroom, and in that moment of absolute betrayal, I stopped being the daughter they could step on. It has been 7 years since that night, and while they probably think I disappeared into the snow, they are about to find out that a single phone call can dismantle a legacy built on cruelty. Before I tell you how I watched their world burn to the ground, please let me know what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. If you believe that no child should ever be thrown out into the cold, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because your support helps me share the truth. Now let me take you back to where the cracks in our family first began to show, before everything finally shattered. Long before the snow ever touched the ground in Portland, the foundations of our household were already rotting under the weight of a systemic and cruel favoritism that defined my entire childhood. Growing up in that house felt like living in a museum where I was the only person not allowed to touch the exhibits or speak above a whisper. My mother Glenda operated under a strict hierarchy where Lily was the sun, and the rest of us were merely debris caught in her orbit. Every morning started with Glenda meticulously preparing Lily's favorite breakfast while I was left to scrounge for whatever cereal was nearing its expiration date in the back of the pantry. When Lily decided she wanted to take ballet lessons, my parents Patrick and Glenda didn't hesitate to spend thousands of dollars on the best instructors and the most expensive equipment. However, when I asked for a simple set of paints for my school project, Glenda told me that we had to be frugal and that I should learn to be grateful for the roof over my head. Patrick was no better, as he spent his evenings helping Lily with her homework or listening to her endless stories about her social life, while he barely acknowledged my presence when I entered a room. I remember one specific afternoon when I had worked for weeks on a science project only for Lily to knock it over because she thought it was taking up too much space on the dining table. Instead of reprimanding her, Glenda looked at the shattered remains and told me that I shouldn't have left my clutter in a communal area where Lily might get hurt. Patrick just sighed and told me to clean it up before dinner because he didn't want any negativity to ruin the atmosphere of the evening. The disparity wasn't just in the material things, but in the very air we breathed, as Lily was allowed to have temper tantrums that lasted for hours while I was punished if I even dared to look upset. My role was to be the silent supporter, the one who washed the dishes, while Lily talked about her dreams of becoming a famous artist, and the one who fetched the mail, while the three of them sat together in the living room. Glenda often reminded me that I was lucky to have an older sister like Lily to look up to, even though Lily never did anything but belittle me when our parents weren't looking. She would whisper cruel things in the hallway, calling me a burden and a mistake, and when I tried to tell Glenda about it, she accused me of being jealous and manipulative. Patrick would always back her up, claiming that Lily was sensitive and that my accusations were a sign of my own failing character. They had created a narrative where I was the problem, the dark spot on their otherwise perfect family portrait, and they repeated it so often that I almost started to believe it myself. By the time I was halfway through high school, I had learned to make myself as small as possible to avoid their wrath or their disappointment. I spent most of my time in the library or at the park, anywhere that wasn't that suffocating house where my worth was measured in how much I could sacrifice for Lily. I watched as Lily received a brand new car for her graduation, a vehicle that was purchased using a savings account I had been told was for both of our futures. When I questioned Patrick about it, he told me that Lily needed a reliable car for her college commute and that I would have my turn when the time was right. Glenda added that as the younger sibling, it was my duty to support Lily's success because her achievements would eventually benefit the whole family. It was a lie they told so effortlessly that it made me wonder if they had any conscience at all, or if they had simply convinced themselves that I didn't have feelings. I began to realize that no matter how hard I worked or how much I complied, I would never be enough for them because Lily was the only one who truly mattered. This realization was like a cold stone in my stomach, a weight that stayed with me as the seasons began to change and the first signs of winter approached Portland. I started keeping a journal not of my feelings, but of the things they said, and the money they spent, a record of the debt they were accruing against my soul. I didn't know then that this journal would eventually become the blueprint for their downfall, but I knew I needed to hold on to some piece of the truth. While they were busy planning Lily's next big step, I was quietly observing the cracks in their facade, waiting for the moment when the pressure would finally become too much for their lies to hold. The air was getting crisper, and the first frost was beginning to settle on the grass, a silent warning of the storm that was brewing both outside and within the walls of our home. Patrick and Glenda were so focused on Lily's bright future that they didn't notice the fire in my eyes or the quiet strength I was building in the shadows. I was no longer the little girl who cried when she was ignored. I was a witness, and I was beginning to understand that witnesses have the power to change everything. 10 days before Christmas, the festive atmosphere in Portland was shattered by a demand that proved my parents' cruelty knew no bounds. The house was already decorated with lights that felt like a mockery of the darkness growing inside, and Lily had been moping for days because she claimed her current creative space was stifling her artistic genius. My mother Glenda was hovering around her with tea and comfort, while my father Patrick was looking through architectural magazines as if he could magically expand the house with a thought. During dinner, Lily suddenly set her fork down and announced that she had found the perfect solution to her creative block, which was to take over my bedroom because it had the best natural light for her paintings. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs, because that room was the only place in the world where I felt even remotely safe from their constant judgment. Glenda immediately brightened at the suggestion, clapping her hands and saying it was a brilliant idea that would surely help Lily reach her full potential as an artist. Patrick nodded in agreement, stating that it made perfect sense for the most talented member of the family to have the best resources available to her. I tried to speak up, my voice trembling as I pointed out that I needed my room for my studies and that the attic space they were suggesting for me was drafty and lacked proper flooring. The moment the words left my mouth, the atmosphere shifted from festive to lethal, and Patrick slammed his hand on the table so hard the plates rattled. He told me that I was being incredibly selfish and that I should be honored to contribute to my sister's career instead of whining about a room I didn't even pay for. Glenda glared at me with a coldness that made the winter air outside seem warm, accusing me of trying to sabotage Lily's happiness out of pure spite. Lily, sensing the shift, began to squeeze out fake tears, sobbing that she just wanted to make the family proud and that she didn't realize her own sister would hate her so much. This performance sent Glenda into a protective frenzy, and she stood up, walking around the table to tower over me while she hissed that I was a disgrace to their name. She told me that from now on I would sleep in the basement or the garage until I learned how to be a team player and that my room would be cleared by morning. I stood my ground for the first time in my life, stating that I had rights and that they couldn't just treat me like a piece of furniture they could move whenever Lily had a whim. That was when the first blow landed as Glenda's hand connected with my cheek in a sharp, stinging slap that echoed through the silent dining room. Patrick didn't move to stop her. Instead, he stood up, and told me that my attitude was no longer tolerable and that I needed a harsh lesson in humility. He grabbed me by the arm, his grip like iron, and began dragging me toward the back door, while Lily watched with a look of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. I struggled against him, crying out for them to listen, but Glenda was already opening the door to the backyard where the Maine blizzard was starting to howl. The wind whipped into the kitchen, bringing with it a flurry of ice and snow that felt like needles against my skin as Patrick shoved me out onto the wooden deck. He told me that I could stay out there until I was ready to apologize to Lily and accept my new living arrangements without another word of complaint. I turned back to the door, pleading with him to let me at least grab a heavier coat, but he just shook his head and told me that my stubbornness was the reason I was out there. Glenda stood behind him, her arms crossed, looking at me with a mixture of disgust and indifference that hurt far more than the freezing wind. "Only Lily matters in this house, Janelle," she said, her voice cutting through the sound of the storm like a knife. "You are nothing but a drain on our resources, and until you learn your place, you can stay out there in the cold." With those final devastating words, they retreated back into the warmth of the kitchen, and I heard the heavy click of the deadbolt sliding into place. I pounded on the glass, my fingers already turning numb, but they didn't even look back as they walked away toward the living room. Lily was the last one I saw as she paused by the window to give me a small mocking wave before she turned off the kitchen light. I was left in the pitch black of the backyard, surrounded by a swirling vortex of white, with the realization that my parents had truly chosen to endanger my life for the sake of a bedroom. The sheer logic of their cruelty was staggering, as they were willing to risk me freezing to death just to avoid an argument with their favorite daughter. I slumped against the siding of the house, trying to shield myself from the wind, but the blizzard was relentless, and I knew I couldn't stay still for long. I began to realize that this wasn't just a punishment, it was a declaration of war, and if I wanted to survive the night, I had to stop being a victim. I started to look for any source of shelter, my mind racing through the layout of the backyard and the outbuildings we had. I knew there was a small tool shed near the fence, but it wasn't insulated, and I wasn't sure if it was even unlocked. Every step I took felt like I was walking through wet concrete, the snow already several inches deep and rising fast. I looked back at the house, at the warm glow of the windows where my family was likely settling in for a cozy evening, and I felt a surge of cold, hard resolve. I wasn't going to die out here just to give them the satisfaction of being right, and I wasn't going to beg for their mercy ever again. 2 o'clock in the morning arrived with a bone-chilling silence that only a Maine winter can produce, as I huddled in the corner of the unheated tool shed. The shed was filled with the smell of rusted metal and old gasoline, but it offered a meager shield against the direct blast of the wind that was screaming outside. I had managed to find some old burlap sacks and a tattered tarp to wrap around myself, but my toes and fingers were already losing sensation, a terrifying sign of encroaching frostbite. My heart felt like it was beating in slow motion, a dull thud against my chest that reminded me I was still alive, despite the efforts of my parents to forget me. I had my old smartphone in my pocket, the screen cracked but still functional, and I spent the hours documenting the temperature and filming short clips of the snow drifting through the gaps in the shed walls. I wanted a record of this, a digital testament to the night. Patrick and Glenda decided that their younger daughter was worth less than a few square feet of floor space. I took a video of my shivering hands and the way my breath turned into a thick cloud of ice in the dim light of the phone screen. I also recorded the distant sound of the wind, a mournful howl that seemed to echo the emptiness I felt inside when I thought about the people inside that warm house. I decided to text my best friend Derek, not because I wanted him to call the police and escalate the situation while I was still trapped, but because I needed someone to know where I was. I told him that if I didn't text him by 7 in the morning, he should send help to the backyard of my house and tell them exactly what happened. Derek replied almost instantly, his messages filled with a mixture of horror and fury, offering to come over right then to pick me up. I told him no because I knew Patrick would just accuse him of trespassing and use it as an excuse to further isolate me from the world. I needed to handle this on my own terms to gather enough evidence of their neglect that they wouldn't be able to lie their way out of it later. Derek stayed on the line with me, sending me jokes and stories to keep my mind active and prevent me from slipping into the dangerous sleep of hypothermia. His presence in the digital world was the only thing keeping me grounded as the physical world tried to freeze me into a statue. I watched the battery percentage on my phone drop slowly, a countdown to the moment I would be truly alone in the dark. Around 3 in the morning, I crept out of the shed and moved toward the house, staying in the shadows to avoid being seen if anyone happened to be awake. I reached the living room window and peered inside, seeing the embers of the fire still glowing in the hearth and the comfortable blankets draped over the sofa. It was a scene of domestic peace that felt like a personal insult, a visual representation of the comfort they had stolen from me to give to Lily. I saw Patrick's reading glasses on the side table, and Glenda's half-finished glass of wine, evidence of a night spent in relaxation while I was fighting for my life. Then I looked up at my old bedroom window on the second floor, seeing the light still on and the shadow of Lily moving around inside. She was already arranging her canvases and brushes, moving with a frantic energy that showed she didn't have a single thought for the sister she had displaced. I pulled out my phone and recorded her through the glass, capturing the image of the thief in my sanctuary while the blizzard swirled around me. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie about someone else's life, a story of a family that had finally unmasked its own rot. I went back to the shed, my body shaking so violently that I could barely keep my balance on the icy ground, and I wrapped myself back in the burlap. I started to think about my grandfather Arthur, who lived a few towns away and had always been the only person to show me genuine kindness. He was a retired judge, a man who believed in the letter of the law and the importance of personal integrity, qualities that my father had clearly failed to inherit. I realized that Arthur was the only person who could truly help me, not just by giving me a place to stay, but by guiding me through the legal maze I was about to enter. I began to formulate a plan, a long-term strategy that didn't involve immediate confrontation, but focused on ultimate accountability. I would wait for the morning, find a way to escape the property, and get to Arthur's house before my parents even realized I was gone. I knew they would assume I had crawled back into the basement or that I was hiding somewhere in the house, waiting to apologize for my disobedience. They had no idea that the girl who walked out of that backyard in the morning would be a stranger to them, a person who had buried her love for them in the snow. The cold was no longer an enemy, it was a catalyst, a force that was hardening my resolve into something unbreakable and sharp. I spent the rest of the night practicing my breathing, focusing on the tiny bit of warmth I could preserve in my core, and waiting for the first light of dawn. I was tired of being the girl who nwang hin, the girl who understood, and the girl who took the blame for things she didn't do. As the sky began to turn a bruised purple, signaling the end of the longest night of my life, I felt a grim sense of anticipation. The storm was far from over, but the next phase of the battle would be fought on my ground with my rules, and I was ready. Sometime after dawn, the first rays of a weak winter sun hit the frost on the windows, and I saw Lily standing there with the expression of pure, calculated malice. I had moved back to the deck, hoping that seeing my frozen state would finally trigger some shred of humanity in my parents, but instead, I found Lily staring at me through the glass. She was holding a steaming mug of cocoa, the warmth of the drink visible in the way the steam curled around her face, and she was smiling. It wasn't a smile of pity or even of victory. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed watching another creature suffer for their own amusement. She pulled a piece of paper from her pocket and pressed it against the window, the words, "Know your place," written in bold black marker. I stared at her, my eyes stinging from the cold and the lack of sleep, and I didn't look away when she mouthed the word, "Goodbye," before closing the heavy curtains. A few minutes later, the back door opened just a crack, and my mother Glenda tossed a small duffel bag onto the snow-covered deck without even looking me in the eye. She told me that since I was so determined to be difficult, my father had decided that I should go live with Arthur for a while, until I learned how to be grateful. Patrick's voice echoed from the kitchen, shouting that he had already called a cab and that it would be at the end of the driveway in 5 minutes. He warned me that if I tried to come back inside before, then he would call the police and have me removed for causing a disturbance. I picked up the bag, my hands fumbling with the frozen zipper, and found that they had only packed a few of my oldest clothes and none of my school books or personal electronics. They were effectively erasing me from the house, treating my departure not as a family crisis, but as a long overdue cleaning project. I didn't argue, I didn't scream, and I didn't let a single tear fall while I walked down the long, icy driveway toward the main road. The cab was waiting there, the driver looking at my disheveled state with concern, but I just told him the address of Arthur's house and stared out the window. As we pulled away, I looked back at the house one last time and saw the three of them standing on the front porch looking like the perfect American family. Lily was tucked under Patrick's arm, and Glenda was waving at a neighbor as if everything was normal, as if they hadn't just spent the night torturing their youngest child. I felt a surge of nausea, but I forced myself to keep watching until the house disappeared behind a bend in the road, marking the end of my life as their daughter. When I arrived at Arthur's house, he was already waiting on the porch, his face etched with a mixture of sorrow and a growing, dangerous anger. He had seen the messages I sent to Derek, and he had spent the night preparing his guest room and contacting his old colleagues in the legal profession. He didn't ask me to explain anything right away. He just wrapped me in a thick wool blanket and led me to the kitchen where a bowl of hot soup was waiting. For the first time in 15 years, I felt like someone actually saw me, not as a burden or a tool, but as a human being who deserved to be safe and warm. Arthur listened to my story in silence, his eyes fixed on the video clips I had recorded during the night, and I could see the judge in him weighing the evidence. He told me that what Patrick and Glenda had done wasn't just bad parenting. It was a criminal level of neglect that could have ended in a tragedy. He also revealed something that made my blood run colder than the blizzard Patrick had been dipping into a trust fund that Arthur had set up for my education. Apparently, my father had been using that money to fund Lily's lifestyle and cover up his own failing business ventures, thinking that I would never find out. Arthur promised me that he would protect me, but he also advised me that if we went to the police right, then Patrick would likely use his influence to minimize the charges. He suggested that we play a longer game, one where I would grow strong and independent, while we quietly gathered more evidence of their financial and emotional crimes. I agreed because I didn't just want them to get a slap on the wrist. I wanted them to lose everything they had used to hurt me. I spent the next few years living with Arthur, throwing myself into my studies and learning everything I could about the law and financial management. I stopped responding to the few half-hearted emails Glenda sent, and I blocked Lily on every platform after she sent me a photo of her new art studio in my old room. I worked multiple jobs, saved every penny, and built a life for myself that had nothing to do with the people in that house in Portland. Every time I felt tired or discouraged, I would look at the video of Lily smirking at me through the window, and my resolve would be renewed. I wasn't just surviving. I was preparing for the day when the debt they owed me would finally come due with interest. I knew that Patrick and Glenda thought they had won, that they had successfully pruned the weak branch of their family tree to let Lily bloom. They had no idea that I was the one who was growing while their own foundations were slowly being eaten away by the greed and arrogance they had nurtured. The girl they threw out into the blizzard was gone, replaced by a woman who knew exactly how to use the cold to her advantage. I was no longer afraid of the storm, because I had become the storm, and I was just waiting for the right moment to make landfall back in Portland. 7 years after that night in the snow, I stood in my office in Boston and looked at a glossy invitation to my father's legacy gala in Portland. The invitation was an exercise in vanity, featuring a photo of Patrick, Glenda, and Lily, looking radiant, celebrating Patrick's 30 years of service and integrity in the business community. They looked untouched by time, as if the cruelty they had inflicted on me had only served to polish their public image and strengthen their bond. I knew from my research that Patrick's company was struggling, and this gala was a desperate attempt to attract new investors by projecting an image of stability and success. Lily had also managed to build a career as a social media artist, selling mediocre paintings for inflated prices to people who were impressed by her family's supposed prestige. I had been waiting for this exact moment, the point where their ego was at its peak, and their actual resources were at their lowest. I picked up the phone and dialed the number of the private investigator I had hired a year ago, a woman who had successfully tracked the movement of my stolen trust fund. She confirmed that she had the final set of bank statements showing that Patrick had forged my signature to liquidate the last of my education savings just months ago. This was the missing piece of the puzzle, the clear-cut evidence of felony fraud that would be impossible for him to explain away as a misunderstanding. I then called the lead investigator at the Maine Department of Health and Human Services, a man I had been in contact with for months regarding the history of neglect in the household. I provided him with the digital copies of the videos I took when I was 15, along with the contemporary witness statement from Derek and the legal analysis provided by Arthur. I told him that I was ready to move forward with a formal complaint, not just for the past neglect, but for the ongoing financial exploitation that was still occurring. The investigator was professional and thorough, acknowledging that the evidence was substantial enough to warrant an immediate and high-profile inquiry. I felt a strange sense of calm as I went through the steps, a clinical precision that came from years of planning and the emotional distance I had built. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about the simple, cold reality of consequence, the natural result of seeds they had planted years ago. I spent the rest of the afternoon coordinating with a journalist I knew who specialized in corporate fraud, ensuring that when the hammer fell, it would be in the full light of day. I wanted the people of Portland to see the true face of the man they were supposed to honor, and the mother who had stood by and watched a crime unfold. I thought about the girl who had shivered in that tool shed, and I wished I could tell her that the silence she endured was actually her greatest weapon. Patrick and Glenda had made the mistake of thinking that, because I didn't fight back then, I would never fight back at all, but they didn't understand the power of a long memory. I didn't want a reconciliation, I didn't want an apology, and I certainly didn't want their money. I wanted the truth to be the only thing left of their legacy. I looked at the clock and realized it was almost time for the gala to begin, a few hours before the authorities would make their move, according to our coordinated plan. I imagined the room filled with the elite of Portland, the expensive champagne and the speeches about character and family values that Patrick was so fond of giving. I could almost see Lily's smug expression as she accepted compliments on her art, basking in the reflected glory of a life she hadn't earned. I felt a momentary pang of something that wasn't quite pity, but a profound sense of the waste they had made of their lives. They could have been a real family. They could have been decent people, but they chose to be predators instead, and now the world was about to see them for what they were. I picked up my car keys and began the drive toward Portland, not to attend the gala, but to be in the city when the news broke. I wanted to be close enough to feel the air change, but far enough away that they couldn't reach out and try to pull me back into their drama. As I drove past the familiar landmarks of the Maine coastline, I felt the weight of 7 years finally starting to lift, replaced by a sense of impending clarity. I checked my phone one last time and saw a message from Arthur telling me that he was proud of the woman I had become and that justice was finally on its way. His support had been the anchor that allowed me to weather the storm, and I knew that whatever happened next, I was no longer that discarded child. The blizzard of my youth was over, and the sun was finally starting to rise on a world where I didn't have to hide or apologize for existing. I arrived in Portland just as the first guests were entering the ballroom of the Grand Hotel, and I took a seat in a quiet cafe across the street. I ordered a black coffee and waited, watching the lights of the hotel and the arrivals of the town's most prominent citizens. I was the ghost at the feast, the silent witness who was about to speak. And I knew that after tonight, the name Janelle would be the only thing my family would ever be able to think about. The wait was finally over, and the first ripples of the coming disaster were already starting to spread through the quiet streets of the city. 3 hours after my final phone call, the polished facade of the Grand Hotel ballroom shattered into 1,000 pieces of public disgrace. I was sitting in the cafe, my eyes fixed on the entrance of the hotel, when I saw the first black SUVs pull up to the curb with an unmistakable authority. Several plainclothes officers and investigators from the State Department entered the lobby, their faces grim and focused, moving with a purpose that silenced the chatter of the nearby guests. A few minutes later, the social media feeds of the local news outlets began to explode, with reports of a high-profile arrest warrant being served during the Legacy Gala. I saw several guests spilling out of the hotel entrance, their faces filled with confusion and shock, as the rumors of fraud and child endangerment began to circulate like wildfire. Then I saw them. Patrick was being led out in handcuffs, his expensive tuxedo jacket rumpled and his face a mask of panicked disbelief. Glenda was following behind, shouting at the officers and trying to cover her face from the flashes of the photographers who had appeared as if by magic. She looked smaller than I remembered, her air of superiority replaced by a frantic animalistic fear that she could no longer control. Lily was the last to emerge, looking abandoned and bewildered as the cameras turned their attention to the rising star whose career was built on stolen funds. She was crying, but they weren't the calculated tears she used to manipulate our parents. They were the tears of someone who realized her gilded world was collapsing. I watched as they were placed into the back of the police vehicles, the blue and red lights reflecting off the windows of the hotel where they had just been the guests of honor. The gala was over, and the legacy Patrick had spent a lifetime building was now a lead story about corruption and cruelty in the evening news. I felt a profound sense of stillness, a quiet closure that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with the simple restoration of balance. The people of Portland were now seeing the reality of the perfect family, and the truth was far more ugly than anyone had imagined. Patrick's business partners were already releasing statements distancing themselves from him, and the gallery that represented Lily announced they were reviewing their association with her. As the police cars drove away, I received a series of frantic, desperate voicemails from Glenda, her voice cracking as she begged me to tell the authorities that it was all a big mistake. She actually had the audacity to tell me that we were a family and that I needed to protect our reputation, as if she hadn't been the one to discard me in a blizzard. Lily sent me a text message filled with vitriol accusing me of ruining her life and calling me a monster for betraying my own flesh and blood. I didn't reply to any of them. I simply listened to the messages once to ensure they were recorded as further evidence of their lack of remorse, and then I deleted them. I knew that in the eyes of the law, Patrick was facing years in prison for the fraud and embezzlement, and Glenda would likely be charged as an accomplice. Their house in Portland was already under a lien, and the assets they had used to fund Lily's lifestyle would be liquidated to pay back the money they had stolen from me. They were losing their home, their status, and their freedom, a cascade of consequences that was as relentless as the storm that had once nearly killed me. The social media backlash was equally devastating as the community they had deceived turned on them with a ferocity that was both swift and total. People who had once sought their favor were now posting stories about their own negative experiences with the family, painting a picture of a household defined by arrogance and deceit. Lily's artistic career was effectively over as her followers realized that her success was a sham funded by the exploitation of her own sister. She would have to find a way to survive in a world where her name was now synonymous with a particularly pathetic brand of entitlement. I realized that the only Lily matters philosophy had finally come to its logical conclusion. Lily was now the only one left to face the ruins of a life she didn't know how to build on her own. Patrick and Glenda would have a long time in a cell to think about the daughter they had thrown away and the one they had ruined by never saying no. I left the cafe and walked through the cold night air of Portland, feeling the crispness of the wind without the old fear that it would consume me. I went to a small park overlooking the harbor and sat on a bench watching the lights of the city and the dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. I thought about the thousands of dollars they had stolen, the years of emotional abuse, and the single night that had changed everything. All of it was now a matter of public record, a story that belonged to the world and not just to the shadows of that house. I felt a sense of peace, that I had never known, a realization that I was finally truly free from the burden of their expectations and their cruelty. I was no longer defined by what they did to me, but by what I had done for myself in spite of them. As the sun began to rise on a new day, I knew that the name Janelle would no longer be a source of shame or a secret to be kept. It was the name of someone who had survived the winter and found her way into the light, and that was enough for me. The city was starting to wake up, and the news of the scandal was the main topic of conversation in every coffee shop and office building. I was just another face in the crowd, a woman with a future that was entirely her own, and I had never felt more alive. Portland today is not filled with storms, but with a clear, biting autumn sunlight that makes the world feel sharp and honest. I am standing in front of the house where I spent the first 15 years of my life, but I am not here as a guest or a victim. The building is now empty, with a for sale sign in the front yard and a legal notice on the door indicating that it has been seized by the court. The windows that once glowed with a warmth that was denied to me are now dark and hollow, reflecting the gray sky and the skeletal branches of the trees. Patrick and Glenda are currently serving their sentences in a federal facility, having been convicted of multiple counts of fraud and child endangerment after a trial that transfixed the entire state. Lily is living in a small, rundown apartment in another city, working a job she hates, and struggling to reconcile her old life with her current reality. I haven't spoken to any of them since the night of the gala, and I have no intention of ever doing so again, because some bridges aren't just burned, they are erased. I have used the recovered funds from my trust to establish a foundation that supports young people who have been victims of domestic neglect and financial exploitation. My life is full. My work is meaningful, and I am surrounded by a family of my own, choosing people like Arthur and Derek who saw my value when I was at my lowest. Standing here, I realize that the blizzard of my youth was actually a gift, a brutal pruning that allowed me to grow into something much stronger than the fragile flower my parents wanted me to be. They thought they were throwing away a nuisance, but they were actually releasing a force of nature that they could never hope to contain. I look at the deck where I once shivered in the dark, and I don't feel the phantom chill anymore. I only feel the warmth of the sun on my face and the solid ground beneath my feet. This house is just wood and stone, a shell that once held a lie, and now it is being returned to the world to be something else. I am not here to gloat, but to acknowledge the end of a chapter and the beginning of a story that I get to write myself. I have learned that justice doesn't always come quickly, and it doesn't always look like a Hollywood ending, but it does come for those who are willing to wait and work for it. My story is a testament to the fact that blood does not give anyone a license to destroy your spirit or your future. Family is supposed to be the place where you are safe from the storm, not the people who push you out into it to satisfy their own selfish desires. If you find yourself in a situation where you are being treated as nothing, remember that your value is inherent and cannot be defined by those who are too blind to see it. It takes incredible courage to walk away from a toxic legacy, but the freedom you find on the other side is worth every moment of the struggle. Never let the coldness of others freeze your heart. Instead, let it harden your resolve to build a life that is so bright and so honest that their shadows can never touch you again. Thank you so much for staying with me through the longest and coldest night of my life, until the final moment of justice. Your support and your time mean more to me than I can put into words, and I am honored to share this journey with you. If this story touched you or reminded you of your own strength, please share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know, if you were in my shoes, would you have chosen the path of silent preparation, or would you have fought back sooner? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to help us bring more stories of resilience and truth to the world. Your voice matters, and together we can ensure that the truth is always heard. Goodbye for now, and remember to keep your own fire burning no matter how hard the wind blows.